Good evening and welcome to tonight's Conservation Commission meeting on May 10th, 7:30 p.m. If anyone else is recording tonight's meeting, please let us know now. As we've done in the hybrid and remote environment, I'll go down the list of Conservation Commission members for opening roll call. Just ask you to verbally confirm your attendance tonight, starting with myself. Stephen Washburn is here. Catherine Walsh is absent this evening. Carly Rockland.
Here.
Peter Bamber.
Here.
John Gear.
Here.
And Kelsey Quinlan.
Here.
Thank you for that. We'll start with a brief introduction. Tonight, as part of this meeting, we'll be holding hearings under the Massachusetts Wetland Protections Act and regulations and the Norwood Wetlands Bylaw and regulations. The commissioners are volunteers that serve to enforce these regulations in order to protect certain values that are identified as being important to Massachusetts and the town of Norwood. The commission decisions are based on these laws and regulations and are not arbitrary or based on personal likes or dislikes. It is important to the commission that the hearings are held in a fair and equitable way for all parties involved. This requires that discussion takes place in a civil manner and that every individual in this meeting is treated respectfully. To facilitate this, the hearing will take place in an order listed on the agenda and will follow a specific format. First, the applicant will present their project to the commission. Next, the commission will direct any questions it has to the applicant and ask the conservation planner or agent any questions or comments that they may have about the application. After the commission is done questioning the applicant, the floor will be open to the public. Comments and questions must be directed to the chairperson during this time, not the applicant or their representative, and they must pertain to the regulations that the commission oversees. For example, they may have concerns over perhaps traffic resulting from a particular. The commission doesn't regulate traffic, so traffic concerns shouldn't really be discussed during this meeting. Please note that while new points will be given ample time to present, repetitive comments may need to be cut short in the interest of all parties being given an opportunity to speak. If you do choose to speak, we just ask you that you please state your name, city or town of residence for the record. With that, we'll begin with our public hearings, starting with 115 Norwood Park South. This is going to be DEP file number 251-0543, Norwood number 2023-04. Applicant is Frank Giglio of 1144 Properties LLC, represented by Deborah Keller of Merrill Inc. Project description is building addition and parking lot improvements in the buffer zone of a bordering and vegetated wetland. And I believe this may have been continued from a previous hearing or.
Yes, I apologize. I actually don't remember what hearing it was continued from, but I think this was last before the board in February. Before we sent it, we continued it to wait for the planning board to have the opportunity to review, and they've completed their review and issued their site plan review, whatever it is they issue from that.
All right. Do we have a representative with us tonight for this?
Frank Giglio from 1144 Properties.
How are we doing tonight, sir?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Frank, if you wanna, or do you
Whatever.
wanna come to the podium?
Yeah, the podium's fine, sure.
Okay.
Explain what.
I'm not going for president. I might want to for president.
It's okay if you're not running for office. It'll just be easier to hear. If you would just give us an update on the state of your progress with the planning board and whether or not there were any significant changes or modifications to the plan since we last saw them.
They were not. They're making just a couple of recommendations. One of them was a review of the landscape plan. There was one tree that we were planting that may not have been indigenous to this area. And I told them that if it isn't, then we'll take it out and change that tree. Other than that, there really weren't any other conditions.
Okay, excellent. And beyond that, no modifications to the plans or figures that were presented previously?
No. The parking lot that we're redoing and resurfacing is basically going into the same spot. The only difference is in the back of the building, I have mechanical units, a chiller unit and generator, and we relocated 2 parking spaces that I felt were dangerous in front of the this generator, and we relocated them to other spots in the parking lot. But as far as the parking lot is concerned, we already have the binder down. It's just going back in the same spot. The berm's going back in the same spot. Nothing is really changing in the parking lot. The only difference would be is in the front of the building, we have a walkway coming in, and I'm a little concerned about the pitch. So I am gonna tie a drain from the front of the front door to the building to a drain. And other than that, there really isn't any other work we're doing there.
All right. Questions or comments from the commissioners? No? All right. Ms. Jones, what do you say?
I think we're ready to close on this. The work has already been done since this was an after the fact filing. So I'd recommend closing the public hearing and issuing an order of conditions with our standard conditions plus a condition matching that planning board condition that the commission be provided with a planting plan to just verify that all plantings are native prior to the landscaping being installed.
And do we have anybody here from the public tonight to speak regarding 115 Norwood Park South?
Hi, Judith Howard, Town Meeting Member, District 3. I just want to know, did I hear you say that there's going to be parking spots in the buffer zone?
No,
Didn't hear me say that, no.
Okay.
Yeah,
no.
yes, Judith, there are parking spots in the buffer zone of a bordering vegetated wetland, which is why the notice of intent came before the commission. It's within the commission's jurisdiction. Those parking spots are not new. They are in the same place that parking spots have been there since the building was built, I believe, in the 80s.
Oh, so.
So there's nothing new.
Before you're doing your renovation and stuff.
Yeah, basically, we're not changing anything. In the back of the building, as I said, in the middle of the lot is the mechanical equipment. And there's 2 parking spaces in front of it. And the loading dock is close to that. And I was very concerned, we're building a medical building there, or medical tenants are going in, that if a truck came in and backed in, those parking spaces would be very tight, and people trying to get out might be difficult. We wanted to move them out, and we also wanted to put more landscaping in front of to kind of shield our mechanical equipment, which I think is nicer. But we didn't diminish really our parking space. We just relocated in the lot.
Okay, thank you very much for telling me.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah. I think the concern was pretty much making sure there was no new impervious surface being,
Right.
developed. Yep, understood. Very good. Any other comments from members of the community for 115 Norwood Park South? Do we have any remote communication surrounding this to be read for the record, Ms. Jones? No? All right. Well, with that in mind, it sounds like we could proceed with a motion as outlined, Ms. Jones, to close the public hearing and issue the order of conditions with the special conditions that she outlined.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr.
Second.
Bamber. Thank you, Mr. Gear. As we've done in the remote and hybrid environment, I'll go down the list of Conservation Commission members and just ask you to verbally state your position on this vote, starting with myself. Stephen Washburn is in favor. Aye. Catherine Walsh is absent. Carly Rockland.
Aye.
Peter Bamber.
Aye.
John Gear.
Aye.
And Kelsey Quinlan.
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And thank you for the concise update, sir. Appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you for your time. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
All right, next up on the agenda, also under public hearings, we're going to have 76 Prospect Street. This is local filing only, Norwood number 2023-06. Applicant is Marion Group LLC, represented by Dan Merrican of Legacy Engineering. Project description is a residential subdivision, including roadway, stormwater infrastructure, and associated earthworks and utilities in the buffer zone of bank and riverfront area of an intermittent stream. How are we doing tonight, team?
For the record, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, David Hearn Jr., Delaware Cabral at 30 Walpole Street on behalf of the applicant. Mr. Merrican is really going to lead the presentation this evening. They have not been before you in a while. I wanted to say hello, and I'm here to try to answer questions, but this is really Mr. Merrican's part of the project, I think, to speak to.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Hearn. Nice to see you.
Okay.
All set?
Ready to go.
All right. My name is Dan Merrick with Legacy Engineering here on behalf of the applicants. We filed a notice of intent, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, under the bylaw for work adjacent to an intermittent stream. So the site is located at 3 house lots on Prospect Street. You can see the property outlined here. It's about 10 acres of land. We have 3 existing homes with driveways, pool, tennis courts, lawn areas. And in the southerly portion of the site here is a resource area system. It basically begins here and ends here. The way this basically works is that we have identified our botanist who's with us tonight remotely. If you have questions for him, has identified a central area that is bordering vegetated wetland. That's this area right here. Downstream of that, they have identified an intermittent stream. It's basically, there's a berm here. I'll explain kind of how that all came to be. And when that little berm gets overtopped, the water in this little pocket of BBW overflows, flows down, and then there's a pipe in the neighbor's yard. A small pipe, it's like an 8-inch PVC pipe. And that ties out to the street drainage system on Fuller Street. So because of that connection to the drainage system, it's being viewed as bordering and not isolated wetland. Upstream of the wetland area is a second intermittent channel, and that goes here. So how this has come to be basically is due to the hydrology of the area. We're essentially at the top of a hill. We're not connected to any other wetland areas. There aren't any other wetland areas around here. What you have is from about here on Myrtle Street, everything pitches into our site. It's underlain by ledge. So there's ledge with some soil on top. And then across the middle of our site is an outcropping or a ridge of soil and ledge. And what that does is it creates a valley. And it's a valley at the surface, and it's also a valley below the ground. The ledge surface below the ground is a valley. So when you get rainfall events, you've got some water running down here, you've got some water running down here. Some of that water soaks into the ground. It creates a perched groundwater condition, which is seasonal and temporary in nature. That groundwater, that perched groundwater runs down this way, and then it kind of all settles in here. And what happens is it runs in this direction. So the photograph that I gave you was taken this afternoon. It is about 10 feet down the upper intermittent stream channel. So you can see that the condition that is out there today is really the normal condition of that channel. It doesn't have water in it very often. It mostly looks like an upland wooded area. What happens though in periods of very significant rainfall, in addition to some surface runoff flowing through there, you'll get a situation where a temporary perched groundwater table will fill up in this valley area. And depending on how much rain you've had, that perched groundwater table will start to break out in this intermittent stream channel. So like when you go out there now, there's no water until you get right down to the bottom of it. But I've seen it in conditions where you had groundwater starting to come out in the intermittent stream about halfway down. And then in really periods of very repetitive rainfall and persistent rainfall, I've seen circumstances where you get groundwater kind of start to break out right at the very top. And at the very top of this is existing developed area. So there's maybe 10 feet of woods there. And then you get right into an existing tennis court. This is all lawn / field, light poles around the tennis court. So what I've shown you on the plan here is for the BVW down in the center, I've shown you the buffer zones. And then for the upstream stream, I've shown you the separate buffer zones. The reason for that is that under the Wetlands Protection Act, a stream is not jurisdictional at the state level unless it has a wetland or another resource area above it. And this has nothing above it. It's just a field and a tennis court. So from the top of the intermittent stream down to the beginning of the wetland area is local bylaw jurisdictional only. It's not state Wetlands Protection Act jurisdictional. The lower intermittent stream is both, because the lower intermittent stream has a BVW above it that feeds into it. So that becomes jurisdictional under both. What we are proposing to do is to basically demolish the 3 existing homes and build a subdivision. You can see the configuration of the road here. Basically, it's a loop. We have house lots along the road. And then here in the center, which is basically where that valley is today, we have proposed a stormwater basin and infiltration basin. Get into some more detail on that. So the second handout I gave you is this. It's just the work in progress. It's not done yet. Holly and I have talked about, proposing a replanting scheme for some areas that are currently developed in the buffer zone to the intermittent stream. So that's something that I'm going to be working on. But you can see this is the top end of the intermittent stream. You can see right here, 10, 12 feet away, you've got a light pole. There's a whole row of burning bushes in here, which are invasive. And then you have the tennis court, and the buffer zone to the intermittent stream extends out to this line here. So probably 2/3 of the tennis court, along with a little outbuilding, is in the buffer zone today. So what we propose to do is to build a road basically right through one of the existing homes, right through the center of the tennis court, right through that outbuilding. And then we propose to essentially take all of the existing disturbance in the buffer zone area here and remove it all. And then replant it, basically return it to a vegetated condition, a natural condition. The work that would be going on in here would be a side slope on the road, a drainage outfall, and then the removal of all this impervious coverage and basically the replanting of all the lawn areas, the field areas around the tennis court that are currently cleared of trees, planting new trees, planting new shrubs, and basically taking this all up. So there's a little bit of work in the 25-foot no disturb, but that's only to remove what's there presently and to remove the burning bushes and replace them with better vegetation. There's some work in the 25 to 50, but again, it's to remove what's there presently and to install a drainage outflow. The proposed road and impervious surfaces will be 65 feet away or so from the top end of that stream. There'll be no impervious surfaces within 65 feet of that intermittent stream in the proposed condition. And on the backside of the inside of the loop is a proposed stormwater basin. So one of the key objectives to our design here is to maintain this existing pattern of surface runoff and groundwater coming down to the bottom of this valley and then basically discharging out and feeding this wetland. It's the only reason that wetland's there. So what we're proposing to do is we're proposing this road basically gets filled up on top of the ground all the way around, and then the cavity that's created when you fill up that road all the way around it becomes our stormwater infiltration basin. And we have it provides all the required treatment. The pre-treatment is catch basins and sediment forebays. The stormwater basin is an infiltration basin. There isn't an outlet at the bottom. The lowest outlet is about 3 inches up from the bottom. So that any water that collects in that bottom 3 inches soaks into the ground. We've provided a stormwater report to you and to the planning board. The planning board has engaged Tetra Tech. They've reviewed the stormwater design. We also did a hydrogeological assessment. Tetra Tech had their hydrogeologist study the property and study the report that was provided to them, and planning board's consultant is satisfied with the drainage design as proposed. And again, the focus here is that we want to recharge as much water as we can, right in this area, right at the bottom of the valley, which is where it's happening now, because that's what's going to support this wetland down here, and it's also going to generate periodic flow through this upper and lower intermittent stream path when the rainfall conditions are right. But essentially, every time you get a rainfall event that generates any runoff, you're gonna have infiltration occurring right here, which is good for the wetland. And that's why we put it there. We had an earlier iteration of this design that did not have a stormwater basin there, and we moved it here on purpose.
That's
So-
that's a 12-inch drain line that connects that infiltration basin to
Yes,
the wetland. Yep.
it's a 12-inch outflow pipe. And that has a smaller opening. So at this end of the pipe, there's a cap with a sized opening that basically is allowing a certain amount of discharge through that. And then, of course, there will still be surface flow into the intermittent stream and the wetland from the adjacent areas. You can see that there's a pretty large area around here that is kind of generating, and it's not a very expensive watershed. As I indicated, there's a ridge that runs right through here. So none of this water up here ever gets into there. It is really only fed by a pretty small surface watershed. And I think more importantly by that, periodic accumulation of groundwater, perched groundwater on the ledge surface that kind of underlies all of this. And the wetland, as you go out there, I was out there today, there's not a lot of water in it. You get big rain, there's some water accumulation in there. It's too small to be isolated land subject to flooding. It dries up every summer. Go out there today, it's just kind of like mucky and muddy. And Holly and our botanists have been on site looking at that wetland 3 or 4 times. They've looked at it every spring for the past 3 years. There's no vernal pool activity at all. So that's been looked at pretty extensively.
You mentioned that the planning board had a peer review performed.
Yes.
Following that, what's the status of the project with their board?
So at the last meeting, the peer review consultant had a few additional things they wanted us to provide for documentation, but they basically said, we're satisfied with the design. So we are going to provide that additional documentation to the planning board and to you, and follow up with those last few items with the peer review consultant. So it's almost done. It's not quite done.
Sounds like you're pretty far down the road. Questions or comments from the commissioners?
Is that a stormwater feature in the northwestern part of the property, the green block?
Yes. So this basin, this is an open vegetated basin that handles runoff, probably very similar to the current watershed area. I think it's this whole part of the site ends up in here. So we have, once you get over this ridge here, everything flows down towards Prospect Street. So we have an underground system proposed here, which functions mainly as a detention facility with a little bit of infiltration. It's specifically designed that way to basically protect adjoining properties. So that is preceded by a proprietary separator, which goes into the underground infiltration system, and then that outflows to the drainage system in Prospect Street.
Mr. Bamber?
I'd like to hear from Mrs. Jones.
Are you done with your presentation?
Yeah.
No. Do you want to hear from me before the presentation is finished?
If he's done, are you done?
Yeah, I think
You
that's
are, okay, sorry. Okay, so the elephant in the room is that we do have riverfront standards that apply to intermittent streams, which the commission has historically, for as long as I've been the agent, given riverfront area to those intermittent streams. So I am not sure, we didn't receive an alternatives analysis and we didn't receive information about what percent of the riverfront area on the site is being altered. And so without those pieces of information, it's difficult to determine if the project is meeting our standards that are set forth for riverfront.
Sharon, I don't mean to interrupt Ms. Jones. I just suspect that this is where I come in.
It sounds like it, sir.
If you want to-
Please.
All right, so, Mr. Chairman, and members of the commission, Ms. Jones has referenced, the question of whether this is a riverfront area. I've given the commission a letter, dated yesterday that raises this question, and suggests that in fact, this is not riverfront, that your regulations that, appear to make an intermittent stream part of the riverfront area are not legal, and they go beyond the authority that you have under the bylaw. My letter lays out that you're bound by the definitions in the bylaw, which was created by town meeting, which is the authority in this matter. And your regulations, by the terms of the bylaw, have to follow those definitions. And you can't go beyond, the point of the regulations is to effectuate the provisions of the bylaw, not to change them. So our position is that looking at the definition of intermittent stream, looking at the separate definition of stream, which is different, looking at the characteristics of an intermittent stream not running year round, whereas the definition of stream in the bylaw says that it runs year round, that they're two different things. And the standards and the definitions and the performance standards with respect to the buffer zone fit an intermittent stream. An intermittent stream belongs there. To make it all of a sudden riverfront area is to take an intermittent stream and change its definition. Now, I'm not saying this was done intentionally, but from a legal point of view, you have no authority to make regulations that go beyond the terms of the bylaw. The point of the regulations are to effectuate the purposes of the bylaw and to, provide more detail. But they cannot, by law, change what the bylaw does. And the bylaw very clearly defines an intermittent stream. Also, the list of resource areas makes clear that intermittent streams are different from streams. So we believe that this does not fit within a riverfront area. If you look at the definitions, you look at the jurisdictional listing of areas within your authority, you cannot call an intermittent stream part of the riverfront area. Now, it's a legal issue, but this is a very important issue that we believe that what we've prepared complies with the bylaw and with the regulations that are applicable. We've not prepared something that would appear or attempt to comply with regulations that are not applicable. So that is why I laid that out in the letter. I had spoken last week to Ms. Jones about it. I spoke to Mr. DeLuca about it, and then put it in writing, the first opportunity I had. When this was filed, there was no mention of riverfront. That only came up, that was raised in the last couple of weeks. We would have responded sooner if it had been raised. And so anyone looking at the regulations, looking at the bylaw, I think in a fair reading of them, you can understand that intermittent streams are not riverfront. And that simply putting them in the riverfront doesn't make them riverfront. And I say that with great respect for the commission, because I understand what you do in terms of writing regulations and all. I'm part of the reason why you have regulations, going back to 2009 and before that, when I pointed out that the commission was making regulations without town meeting authority, and in town meeting, that juncture said, oh yeah, we've got to give them authority to make regulations. And that's how it came about. But you are limited on it. Happy to take questions, but I've laid out the position in the letter, and that's my reading of it. And As I say, it is a legal issue that, as Ms. Jones, she used the phrase I think I was thinking of when I came in here tonight and when we began and even before, the elephant in the room. If you give me our presentation, we believe that complies with the bylaw and with the applicable regs. Doesn't comply with the riverfront, but the riverfront, this is not riverfront from a legal point of view, as far as we argue.
Yeah.
And I understand, you know, some may have a different position. Thank you.
All right, thank you,
Happy to
Mr.
take
Hill.
questions.
Oh, I appreciate that. I would say I agree with your sentiment that it is a legal issue. And with that in mind, while I am a scientist and I dabble in some engineering, I'm not an Esquire. So when I saw this and I saw your letter and reviewed it, I thought immediately to ask Ms. Jones to request town council review the document and provide some input. So Ms. Jones, if you would just perhaps provide the
Yeah.
commission with a description of that exchange.
So I did speak briefly with Norwood's Town Council, Mr. DeLuca, earlier today. And he didn't have a chance to do an extensive review, but his, the main insight that he contributed to the commission is that he thought that a judge, in looking at the definition of stream versus intermittent stream, or perhaps even perennial stream, would be looking at how the word is used commonly within the field, as well as at the definitions that are provided in the bylaw itself. So the bylaw does define intermittent stream, it defines stream, and it defines riverfront area. And I think that the point that Mr. Hearn is making is not an unreasonable one, but one that differs from my own interpretation. So Mr. DeLuca's insight was really that in refining which way to interpret it, it might be how those words are used routinely within the field, which might, you know, he suggested consulting a professional wetland scientist about it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Mr. Hearn, please.
The bylaw, which is where you derive your authority as far as these regulations go, says that these regulations, it first says the commission, after public notice and hearing, the commission shall promulgate rules and regulations to effectuate the purposes of this bylaw. Then goes on to say, these regulations shall reiterate the terms defined in this bylaw and find additional terms not inconsistent with the bylaw. So there's no need to go outside to what some might call common usage when the bylaw clearly defines what an intermittent stream is. It's there in the bylaw. Town meeting put that there when this bylaw was adopted and when it's been amended. In fact, that's probably part of the amendment that authorized the regulations in the first place in 2009. So I don't think you have to go beyond and ask somebody what the common understanding of an intermittent stream is. I would say the common understanding of an intermittent stream is that it's intermittent. That's why it's called that. Intermittent meaning not all the time. It's been defined in the bylaw as body of water which does not flow throughout the year, whereas a stream is defined to flow year-round. That's in our bylaw. And so they're two different animals, and that's what brings us to where we are now. You don't have to go outside and say, gee, the bylaw is ambiguous. Let's consult a dictionary. Let's look at the common usage. Very clearly defined in the bylaw. And so with that, we have an intermittent stream. Nobody says it's anything but an intermittent stream. And if it's an intermittent stream, then we go to the buffer area, and we are the jurisdictional provision, section 3, talks about when it defines resource areas, lands within 100 feet of any of the aforesaid resource areas, rivers, streams, and creeks, whether perennial or intermittent, known as the buffer zone. The next entry, number 18, refers to lands within 200 feet of any river, stream, or creek. It does not call out or include intermittent streams in that, whereas the previous one makes clear that intermittent streams are included. So an intermittent stream is a kind of stream, but it's not the kind of stream that's in the riverfront. So I'll leave it at that. It is a legal question more than anything else. Mr. DeLuca has my letter. I sent it to him. I had spoken with him last week about it, told him I would be submitting something.
Mhm.
And I did not expect him to give a hard and fast answer to me or anybody really, because it's kind of early on that. But we have to raise it because it affects what we're all talking and thinking about here.
Yeah, certainly.
For the record, my alternate interpretation that supports the way that the commission has historically regulated riverfront for intermittent streams largely stems from the list of regulated resource areas, number 13 of which is streams including intermittent streams, which leads me to believe that intermittent streams are included in streams. Although it's true that the definition of stream does say year-round. We don't have a definition of rivers in our bylaw, and we don't have a definition of perennial streams. And so I suspect that intermittent streams were called out specifically to emphasize that those are subject to protection that's not granted within the Wetlands Protection Act. But that streams as a term was not meant to exclude intermittent streams, but rather to include them.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is where we could debate this for a long time, but
Certainly.
today, perennial streams, I understand to be streams that are always flowing.
Yes,
That's called out in the definition of stream. So the definition of stream is essentially the definition of a perennial stream. It says flowing year round. That's in the bylaw. The definition of an intermittent stream is one that does not flow year round. Two different things. They both have stream in them, but that doesn't make them the same thing for the purposes of the bylaw and the regulations, particularly when you include something specifically. You're excluding everything else. And when you call something out specifically, the more specific is normally going to control from the point of view of legal interpretation. So they call out an intermittent stream, they include it in the buffer area, they do not include it in the riverfront area. There'd be no point to having the definition of buffer zone if all of that stuff was in the riverfront. But it isn't. So
well, we have different standards for buffer zone than we do for riverfront. It's a
But-
different resource area,
except
although
that,
they often,
except that if everything that is extreme is in the riverfront area, then from the point of view of an intermittent stream, there'd be no point of defining it as within the buffer zone because it's within the riverfront. It makes a difference between 100 feet of protected area in which some things may take place at certain points and 200 feet of river area in which perhaps nothing can be done. And if you carry it out on this site and say that it's a 200-foot riverfront area, you not only affect what happens on our property, but on more than a dozen nearby properties, neighboring properties. They're going to fall within the 200 feet. And those folks will not get to do what they probably think they have a right to do on their properties because you'll be defining it as riverfront. I don't think that's the intention. That's the potential effect of this. So I don't know how you want to handle it. We've given the presentation that we believe is appropriate for the regulations and our interpretation of it. And I think that it is an interpretation that a court would look at and say, whoever wrote these was very specific. They weren't vague about an intermittent stream. They weren't vague about what the buffer zone was. And the commission has, in its regulations, taken that and expanded the riverfront jurisdiction to include those. And that's not what, you can't go beyond what the bylaw authorizes you to do when you're writing regulations. So I'd ask you to consider that. I don't expect you're necessarily going to agree with me tonight. I'm not sure how you want to proceed. I'm sure there are others who will want to weigh in on that.
Likely. Yep. Thank you, Mr. Hearn. I appreciate you. Mr. Bamber, you had something?
Well, Attorney Hearn knows I have the utmost respect for him. I think we're gonna have to agree to disagree. Again, not being a lawyer, I do know the intent of this bylaw. I do know the intent of the reason why intermittent stream has been included as one of the people who put the bylaw together. And so I essentially disagree at this point with your interpretation. And frankly, I don't know if you'd want to speak with the public, but my attitude would be to continue this until we hear back from Mr. DeLuca as to any further view of it. I fully comprehend what you're saying, Attorney Hearn, but I just think we need to look into, you also brought up other areas that impacts on neighbors, et cetera. We need to look into this a little bit further and see how things are actually interpreted as, again, not being a lawyer, the way I understand it, law is interpreted, particularly by judges on the facts. So let's see what the people have to say on the subject.
Yeah, I appreciate what you have to say, Mr. Bamber, in particular about the intent, right, when this was written.
There were three of us putting it together before it went through town meeting, before it went, before it went through review by town council and before the Attorney General's office looked at it also. So,
Mr. Chairman, may I speak to that last point? No question about the bylaw.
Yeah.
The bylaw
mhm.
had to be approved by town meeting.
I don't disagree with you.
No.
You
My
know,
point is the regulations are not.
Mhm.
Regulations are passed by you after public hearing.
mhm.
I don't believe the Attorney General reviews them. So I
My
would not,
understanding is that once it became a bylaw, the Attorney General had to
the
approve.
bylaw, I'm talking about the regulations.
Right, no, you're correct.
So the patina of authority that might come from the Attorney General reviewing a bylaw does not apply to the regulations. And that,
Right,
our problem is
understood.
with the regulations, not with the bylaw.
Understood. Other questions or comments from the commissioners?
So if we were to consult with Council DeLuca
Mhm.
and then as well with a professional wetland scientist, that would be helpful, right? Interpreting use of terms as
Certainly.
are understood in the field. So I would think it'd be both DeLuca and wetland scientists.
Yeah, in particular, I feel like Mr. DeLuca's involvement is critical because, yeah, I know, at least speaking personally, I'm not a lawyer and I just, yeah. Yep. Mr. Gear?
I agree, we have to get it resolved one way or another, we have to know where we're heading, so I would go along with that.
Okay. Ms. Jones, do we have any remote communications from the public that we should read for a matter of record?
We have a number of comment letters that were submitted that will not be read tonight because they're extremely extensive and detailed. A number of residents who submitted those are in the audience tonight and will likely be able to speak to the concerns that were raised.
So do you want me to start with in-person comments and then perhaps in the wake of that, if there's something you have remotely communicated that still hasn't really been touched upon, we could then bring that to front? Yep.
That sounds like a good approach.
Okay, I like it. All right, with that in mind, let's turn to the folks from the community that are here in person to speak regarding this hearing. I see a gentleman with his hand up front and center.
I'm anxious.
If you take the podium, identify yourself for the matter of record regarding who you are and where you live, and then you could dive right into your questions or comments.
Great, thank you. My name is Dan Hill. I'm a land use attorney, and I represent several of the neighbors and the butters to this project. And I think the list of our neighbors has been provided to the planning board. I can provide that to you as well. Most of whom are here tonight. And I would like the opportunity to weigh in just briefly on this question of law And it is a question of law, and for that reason, it's actually not even appropriate to bring this before the commission. This is not, it's not your job to adjudicate an interpretation question of the regulation. It's a question that it belongs in front of a judge, to be frank. The challenge to the validity of your regulation is something that the applicant can certainly raise if they're unhappy with the decision that you render. In the meantime, the applicant should be providing to you what's required under the regulation, which is delineating the riverfront area on the plan, which they haven't done, and providing the alternatives analysis that's required under your regulation. Attorney Hearn stated in his letter to you yesterday, which we just got this afternoon, that the bylaw, quote, clearly distinguishes between intermittent streams and perennial streams. To me, it's about as clear as mud. There are definitions of intermittent stream, there's a definition of stream, but I mean, I'm reading the same section everyone else is, and the section that defines the riverfront is lands within 200 feet of any river, stream, or creek. So what does that mean? I think the interpretation that you've been using for the last however many years is reasonable. Is his interpretation reasonable? Maybe. But at best, there's an ambiguity. And the rule says, and there's plenty of rules to guide local boards and judges on this question, because this isn't the first time that a regulation has been adopted that questionably conflicts with the statute, or in this case, a bylaw. And the leading case on this is Goldberg versus the Board of Health of Granby. And in that case, the Supreme Judicial Court in 2005 said, it depends on whether the language of the statute or the bylaw is ambiguous. And if it's ambiguous, then there's deference to the board in how it interprets its own bylaw. If it's not ambiguous, if the statute, or in this case, the bylaw is crystal clear, then you don't have to worry about deference. You just apply the correct standard of law. But that's not the case here. At best, this is ambiguous. And that means you're entitled to deference. Now, Mr. Hearn might say, well, that deference only goes so far. He can make that legal argument, but it's not this board's job to adjudicate this. And honestly, it's not even Attorney Dave DeLuca, who I respect and have known for many years. It's really a question of law for the judge. So in the meantime, the commission should just ask the applicant to produce the information that will be required in your regulation, and he can reserve his right to challenge this at some later date. Moving on to the substantive issues that we have with this application. We did submit to you last week by your deadline 2 comment letters, one from John Chesius, a civil engineer with decades of experience peer reviewing projects just like this, as well as Patrick Garner, who is a wetland scientist who also has over 30 years of experience peer reviewing projects for conservation commissions around the state, former past president of the Mass Association of Conservation Commissions. And Pat submitted a letter that raises a few issues. Pat couldn't be here tonight. John is here and will speak. And I just want to briefly touch on the highlights of Pat's letter. And probably most importantly, he questions the accuracy of the delineation on the plan. Now, Mr. American referenced a BVW area and then an intermittent stream that goes through it. And he's suggesting that the intermittent stream on the south side or southwest side is just a stream and not a BVW. Mr. Garner has been as close as he can to the site, being on private property, and is very skeptical of that suggestion. He believes that that area that's flagged A1 through A18 is actually BVW. That has an impact on this project because that would then expand your buffer zone in the state law buffer zone to that area. Mr. Garner also mentioned that he also raised the issue that we just discussed with the riverfront area not being delineated or an alternative analysis being provided. And then Mr. Garner also raised the point that there's likely to be a very strong hydrogeological impact from the construction of the project, because this is going to require a significant amount of ledge removal, and that's going to have predictable changes to the hydrology of the site, including water inputs, surface and groundwater inputs to this wetland. And you folks may be familiar with the concept of a water budget, where you really need to balance your pre and post water inputs to a wetland. There's been no analysis in the NOI as to the pre and post inputs to this wetland, and that's something that we would request the commission to ask the applicant to provide. There was a mention tonight about the status of peer review on the planning board side. Tetra Tech has reviewed the drainage system. I would not say that Tetra Tech has signed off on it. The planning board at the last hearing was quite skeptical of some of these outstanding issues. We spent a lot of time discussing the outstanding issues. Mr. Chesia will speak tonight about really foundational concerns with the drainage design, which the planning board heard and has asked be addressed in future meetings. There's been no peer review hydrology report as far as I know. I mean, it may be the case that Tetra Tech's hydrologist has reviewed this site, but I haven't seen any letter to that effect. So without any further ado, I would like Mr. Chesia to summarize his comments on the drainage system.
So I'm John Chesia. I'm a professional civil engineer. I have been for almost 30 years now. And I did review the plan for the neighborhood group, and this is primarily what I do. I do it for a lot of different municipalities. I do it for attorneys. I don't do too many private things, but I've spent also decades designing projects of this nature, all kinds of different things. So I have a fairly extensive letter, but I wanted to just focus on a few aspects that makes sense. So first off, the stormwater regulations have been adopted as part of the Wetland Protection Act, which means that it is within your jurisdiction. Stormwater is within your jurisdiction. You look at the forms that are submitted, there's a DEP stormwater checklist. That's the DEP thing. What do? Checks off all the different things that you comply with the various standards. So if you are in the buffer zone, which they are of a wetland, and they're doing work in the buffer zone of the wetland, they are required to comply with stormwater regulations completely. There's 10 standards. Now this project has some water that's directed to the wetland, some water that's directed to the road. There's all kinds of different systems proposed. There's open basin, there's a subsurface basin. And also they claim that all of the houses, or pretty much all the houses, will have their own subsurface infiltration systems that don't really have much of any design. They don't have test pits for all of them. They don't have all the information, but the runoff relies on them. It's missing a lot of information. Many of the systems that they proposed are the underground systems. Some of them are along a retaining wall, and below the retaining wall is a French drain to collect the runoff, anything that doesn't get picked up. I mean, this kind of defeats the purpose. One of the standards is to maintain groundwater. One of the things they're proposing is to blast all this ledge, to put drains around all of the foundations of the houses, to pump that or gravity drain it into a collection system within the road, to dump it into the municipal system. If that's not going to change the groundwater condition on the property, I don't know what is. That's about as obvious of a thing that you could possibly imagine. The infiltration basin that's contained within the road, they dug test pits. Some of the test pits, I mean, you'd hit the ledge with a shovel that was inches. There was some soil, but it's not consistent. You have to have a certain depth of soil underneath these systems for them to work properly, and you can't depend on bringing soil in. That's like saying for a septic system, I got all ledge, I'll just put some sand on it, it'll be fine. It doesn't work that way. When you put a road between the infiltration system and where it presumably currently goes according to the presentation, is that going to be the same condition as now? I would say not. You compact the soil. There's no specific specification of how they're going to do that so that the water continues to go through. You're going to strip off all the top and subsoil. You're going to compact whatever you put in so the road doesn't settle. And then you're going to blast all around it, creating fractures everywhere with groundwater systems to collect that water. It's quite suspect, at the least, to say that that's going to work the way it was described. I think there's a lot of questions on that. I have a whole bunch of other ones on other issues. That's, I think, the primary biggest issue is if that basin doesn't work, the wetland will potentially be starved of water. They say there's what, 3 inches of infiltration in the bottom of it. That's not a huge amount. Think about it. There's also 2 pipes from that. One goes to the wetland, one goes the other way. So the hydrology isn't necessarily 100% matched. I think there's a lot more to do on that. And I think that is something that this commission should request potentially their own, expert look at it, because it's definitely a questionable design, especially for a recharge. You're basically draining the whole site, you're blasting out all the ledge, and then you're trying to recharge in a spot that's currently got poor soils and ledge in it. It doesn't seem likely to function as proposed. I have a longer letter with other things, but I figured I'd stick to the main stuff. And if you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you. I appreciate the paraphrasing.
I'd like to just clarify a couple of jurisdictional questions that have been raised with the last 2 speakers. One is that I have reviewed the wetland boundary with the wetland scientist. About intermittent stream, it would be significantly easier for the applicant to meet our standards if it was EVW rather than intermittent stream. Unfortunately for the applicant, it does appear to be intermittent stream. It flows in a defined channel and does not show there's grading. That means that water is not staying there for in the soil for up to 2 weeks of the growing season, and there's no sign of wetland vegetation in that area. So that's one sort of piece of information related to our jurisdiction. The second one is that our stormwater jurisdiction stems from, in this case, the bylaw and regulations, and certainly myself, as well as the planning board and their peer review, reviewed it with an eye to meeting the regulations of the stormwater handbook. But in this case, the regulations that it has to meet are the ones that are set forth in the Norwood Wetlands bylaw regulations, which in a couple of instances are more strict than the stormwater handbook standards, requiring NCRS numbers, as well as evaluating additional storms.
Thank you, Ms. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to some of the?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think that there was a lot of excessive generalization in some of the comments that were raised. We will conclude the process with the planning board's peer review consultant, and that will speak for itself. But the planning board's peer review consultant did have a hydrogeologist study the site. He stood up at a meeting and he said, I have no issues with the design as proposed. On the question of we're not blasting everything, there'll be some ledge removal in certain areas. There will be no blasting in the buffer zone. The issue about foundation drains for houses, this is really just the belt and suspenders approach that the town engineer is asking us to do, to just protect the new homes, to make sure they don't have any issues, whether it comes from a lot of people end up with water in their basement because their downspouts are configured badly and it runs down the foundation and ends up in their basement. So town engineer has specifically asked us to put a foundation drain system around all the houses, but it's not going to de-water the property. These houses are all going to be sitting up. In many places, they're not going to engage with the groundwater table at all. And as I indicated, the groundwater table here is just, it's perched, it's very seasonal. It only appears when there's a lot of rainfall. It's not like there's always groundwater on the site. When we dug our test holes, there was no water in any of the test holes. And we dug test holes all over the property. So that's, and with respect to this infiltration basin, the entire site is comprised of class C and D soils. Soils are classified A, B, C, D, A being the most receptive to infiltration, D being the least. And the stormwater handbook very specifically says that in sites with class C and D soils, infiltration is only required to be provided to the maximum extent practicable. So there's an acknowledgement there that on tricky sites, you might have to do things a little differently than you might normally do. So that's one of the reasons why, you know, in this area here, in this valley that I was talking about, in some areas, it's not an extensive thickness of existing soil, which means that limits the amount of potential infiltration. So when we design this basin, we basically are importing soils under the basin to provide a consistent, steady thickness of soil under the basin that can receive that runoff that's going to soak into the ground. And then it's going to do exactly what it does today, which is it's going to migrate on top of the ledge. Ledge all slopes this way, under the ground. It's going to go right through the road. And it's going to end up out here in our intermittent stream channel and in our wetland. And again, where it appears depends on how much of that rich groundwater is available and out there. But, you know, we've had a lot of rain in the last month or so. As I say, you go out there this afternoon, there's no water in this channel. There's water here. There's no water here. There's no water here. There's water here. So it's only when that groundwater condition really builds up because of a lot of rain that you get enough of a groundwater thickness perched on top of that ledge that you start to see water appear in this channel. You don't see any water appear in this channel unless this thing overflows. So the design specifically is intended to support the recharge to the groundwater table for the health of the wetland. That's really one of the main focuses of this specific design for this project.
Thank you. Ms. Jones, something that comes to mind that was touched on a couple of times here was just the recurring mention of the peer review that was performed for the planning board. And I think that it would be helpful for us to understand a documented extent of like that review, right? What it did cover, what it didn't cover, and what the conclusive findings were, like in black and white, not verbally at a meeting or otherwise, but really understand the extent of what was performed and what the conclusions were, the final conclusions were of the peer review. Because it seems to me that based on Ms. Rockland's suggestion earlier, Mr. Gear sharing in some of her sentiment, that we're heading to a place where we're going to end up engaging in our own peer review of the situation. And I want to make sure that we cover everything that we have interest in, but we also don't end up covering things twice. Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would recommend, if the commission does hire a peer review for this project, I would recommend that we do go through that same peer reviewer so that they're not replicating their own work. The most recent letter from Tetra Tech, the planning board's peer reviewer, was in the folder that we have, and the conclusion, so it was focused on primarily the stormwater system, and there was a separate hydrogeological review and peer review as well. And the conclusion from Tetra Tech was that they supported essentially the ability of the planning board to close the public hearing at this point, and like essentially additional materials could be provided as sort of a
Condition.
Yeah, so they had sort of reached the point where they didn't think that additional review was needed, and they had sort of bullet points of this is what the planning board should still ask for.
Yep. Yep. And as part of the peer review that was performed already, did they verify the delineation of the wetland and
No.
stream?
So that
quality?
hasn't, and I will say, I'm confident that, that the sort of upstream intermittent stream is not BVW, but it is possible that that a peer reviewer might find the actual BVW flags themselves moving in a few feet in one direction or the other. So that could certainly be looked at more closely.
Okay. Other questions or comments from the commissioners before we turn to additional members of the community? All right,
Could I just follow up on a couple points?
sure. You just re-identify yourself, so.
Sure. Dan Hill, the attorney for the neighbors. I just wanted to, I think addressed something that I neglected to mention, and there was a question about jurisdiction in the stormwater management standards of the town bylaw as well as the state standard. I want to express our position that the jurisdiction of this commission is for the entire project site, not just the stormwater that goes into the wetland. To the extent there's any question on that, there is that stormwater area that Ms. Quinlan pointed out near that entrance to the project.
That's
and that actually discharges into the town system, which is a TMDL or a NS4 system that eventually ends up in the Ponset River. And your bylaw actually has language in it that requires the TMDL information to be provided in the NOI. So that is within your jurisdiction under the federal NS4 permit law. There's also a few other provisions of the bylaw which I don't think have been adequately addressed by the NOI so far. And that is the tree survey. The NOI, the plan should contain information about the natural features in the site, including mature trees. We don't believe that's been satisfied. And that's actually something we raised to the planning board because the planning board's own regulations require a tree survey that hasn't been done yet. There's also a potential requirement for a wildlife study. I know you have some discretion on that. I think some neighbors here probably can testify tonight about the wildlife that exists on the site. There's a tremendous diversity of birds and critters in this area, and that should be evaluated. And then finally, one of the biggest concerns I think that we've expressed to the planning board is the lack of protection of the natural features on the site, and really a design that's driven to basically maximize profit. It's not that this development was not a take the site and design around it. It was take a project and make it fit on the site. And unfortunately, that is resulting in significant cuts in bills, which we don't actually even have yet. The applicant has promised to provide that at the next hearing. But we can tell already that this is going to be a tremendously impactful site clearing project. Whether there's blasting or not, I just heard tonight there won't be blasting. We've heard mixed things about whether there's going to be significant ledge removal or not on the site. In any event, there's going to be hydrological impacts. And I'm not actually aware that there was a final report. It was the letter that you mentioned, Holly, is there a new letter that came in from Tetra Tech on hydrogeology? Because it's,
Oh, that was the last letter provided.
is that recent or was that months ago?
It was prior to the last, the 2 meetings ago.
We'll provide some more opinions on those issues. We have a hydrologist who's going to weigh in on that point at the next hearing.
All right,
Great,
thank you.
Mr. Chairman, on the tree topic question.
Tree survey, sure.
Yeah, I just want to give you, so you know, you have your tree filter area, which is the 25 to the 100, and say that you can't remove more than 50%. So the work here is pretty obvious. This area here is not treated. There would be a little bit of work in these two corners here and here. There's an area that's treated about 1,800 square feet. That represents 4.5% of the total tree filter zone around the resource areas. So it's obviously well under 50%.
Thank you. Do we have other members from the community here to speak this evening? Yes? Yes, please. If you just identify yourself for the record, let us know where you come from, where you stay, and let us know what your questions or comments are.
Thank you. Kathy DeGeorge, 11 Myrtle Street. I was wondering if you haven't already done a site visit. I was hoping that you could, because this is a very unique piece of property. I've lived there pretty much my whole life, and a lot of us have lived here for 40 years, so we know what the huge cliffs of ledge are like there and how the water runs off and floods everybody's basements and everything. So but it really is something to see in person if you haven't seen it. So I hope that if you haven't, that you could find a way to see the sites. You can appreciate all the ledge that is there. I did mention in my letter, this is the old quarry in the town. So it is, it's a very difficult piece of property to develop because of that. And the stormwater design, as Mr. Chesney pointed out, is questionable whether or not it's going to function as claimed. And I still continue to be confused. There's a DEP regulation that you can't build a an infiltration basin on top of fill. And you can't build it on top of Class D soils, but that's what's proposed to be doing. So I do think that Tetra Tech is actually, we were told at the last planning board public hearing that Tetra Tech hasn't yet replied to Mr. Chessie's letter, but we're expecting that. So I think that things are still in the process of being reviewed and discussed there. I also did want to reiterate what Mr. Hill was saying, that I included a list of a lot of the wildlife we've seen. So I think it would be great to have the wildlife habitat study done in addition to a tree survey that actually does flag the trees that need to be preserved, that are of a certain size. I look forward to hopefully seeing more of an analysis done so that it sounds like there's interest in having the wetland scientists do a analysis to make sure that the hydrology of the wetland isn't going to be altered, because right now it looks like it will be significantly altered with all the cut and fill and changing of the elevation. The high point of this site is 190 something. It's a 46 feet of difference in elevation along the site. So there's a lot of cut and fill that's going to be done, a lot of changes in topography. The plans include a very tall retaining wall behind Fulton Street property as high as 11.5 feet in some places, and the wall will extend all the way along the Fulton Street properties. So they do have to regrade the land significantly to do what they're doing, and that will, I think, all the construction areas is going to have an impact on the wetland. So I appreciate you taking it.
Thank you. Ms. Jones, would you just remind me of where we are with the history of site visits here?
Yeah, so we didn't end up being able to schedule one before the meeting, but the commission agreed that we would like to do one. I spoke with Mr. Merrick sometime earlier this week about probably looking to schedule one for next week. And my suggestion was to, if we can, to maybe just find a time now in the meeting to do that. So my suggestion would be next Wednesday night, on the off chance that commissioners have Wednesday nights free. So
We can, I'd like to be there with our botanist, so I'm sure we can find a time. If you maybe want to send out a doodle or something, we can find a time next week or next weekend or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Mr. Chairman, I want to be clear, if there's going to be a site visit, are you talking about going as a group,
yes.
as a posted meeting?
So a site visit is information gathering, so there will not be any deliberation at the site visit. It will be only to gather information. That is a common practice for conservation commissions.
Is the public invited?
No, it's not a meeting. It's not a public meeting.
Just want to be clear.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you.
Other members of the community here? Yes, sir, please, if you would just take the podium, identify yourself, let us know where you live, and present your questions or comments.
My name is Francis Hopcroft. I live at 56 Prospect Street. I've also been licensed professional engineer in civil engineering since early 1970s. I was registered for all 6 states, and I can't remember which one came first. It was around 1970 to 72, and I'm still registered in Commonwealth. I taught civil engineering for 23 years at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, and I think I can read the plans and the documents reasonably well. I'd like to ask one question of the board, if I could first, of the commission. I don't mean to be disrespectful with this, but I would like to know whether all the members of the board has received, each member of the board has received all the documents we've submitted and have read them. We're not wasting our time and energy on this. Okay, that's important. There are lots of times when it's not clear that what we've said in the past is not just some magic revelation when I say it on the podium.
Understood.
Given that, I don't need to go through all of those issues, but there are some issues that do concern us. One is the intent to limit this hearing and this discussion to the wetland area. When the Conservation Commission actually has responsibility for a lot more resources on that site. We've alluded to some of them with respect to the groundwater. In particular, those house drains will be discharging directly into the storm drain system, which will discharge into the infiltration basin and then directly into the wetland. That's not a good thing. It will change the hydrology significantly at that point. When you look at the amount of runoff from the site today, which is wooded and overgrown, we get about 10% runoff for any given rainstorm. When you put in a lawn, you get about 20%. When you put in a roadway, you get 100%. That's going to be a significant change to the flows into that wetland. And I think that needs to be evaluated a lot more carefully before proceeding with it. Those wetlands are small. They will only hold a limited amount of water without all flowing everywhere and creating bigger wetlands and bigger problems. I have not seen any data in anybody's analysis that addresses those. I think that stormwater management is going to be key to the runoff from this site and maintaining the existing conditions of runoff. It's easy to say, we're going to change it all and nothing will come off more because it's all going to go in infiltration. Prove it. Just prove it. I haven't seen it. I've seen the claims, but nothing to demonstrate it. So I ask that you also looking at that much more carefully at all the resource areas, the trees, the groundwater, the runoff, the wetland, the adjacent runoff onto adjacent neighbors, and how it changes the hydrology of that entire area. All of which I think is well within the scope of the Conservation Commission. With that, I'll let you read and absorb all the other documents that we've submitted. Those are just the ones in last week, so I know that it's going to take more than an hour to read them all and absorb them. I'm expecting this hearing will be extended, and I'll be happy to address any questions on any of those issues at any time. Thank you.
Thank you. Other members from the community here to speak this evening? Yes? If you just identify your name and where you live for the record.
Certainly. Catherine Khalil, Fulton Street, District 1. And I am not.
We have a number when people give their
Oh,
address. So we know where they live.
72.
Thank you.
Fulton, of course. 72 Fulton Street.
Thank you.
Unlike many of the other people who've come up, I am not. I'm a neighbor. So I have neighbor-like questions, which aren't anywhere near the level of those that were raised by other people. I heard that there's right now going on to Fulton Street, a pipe, and I think I heard 8 inches. And I would like to know, and then I heard a 12-inch, but I wasn't sure which it's going to be under the current plan. And I'm wondering what, under the current plan, what the height is considered to be, and will it take water to Fulton Street in the way that it does now, because we watch the flow go down for days currently. Mm-hmm. And will there be a pipe similarly that's going down Prospect? And perhaps other people more learned than I in this area understand that, but I would ask for clarification, please, about the drain of water under the current plan.
Mm-hmm. I would just say that I appreciate the efforts at a disclaimer about your level of expertise, but it's not at all necessary. Your your interest is appreciated and your question is just fine.
Thank you.
So I think the question is, as a neighbor on Fulton Street, there's some concern about the stormwater pipe that's going to be interconnecting with the municipal system, I think is what is being asked,
Yes.
and the diameter of that pipe.
Yeah, so the way it works is, on one side of the project, we have access directly to Prospect. And so on that side, we're piping our drainage system directly to the Prospect Street drainage system. On the Fulton Street side, we don't. This is all overland flow that goes through this resource area system, and then it flows out this way. There's an existing off-site 8-inch pipe that carries some of that runoff, obviously not all of it. It's a pretty small pipe. So that's a private pipe on private property. We have nothing to do with it. We can't change it. We can't increase it. It's not in our property. So that existing pipe stays exactly as is.
And that 8-inch pipe connects to the municipal stormwater system.
That is our understanding. The neighbor who lives, I believe, here at 101, at one of the planning board meetings, indicated to me that that was the case.
Okay.
That at some point in the past that they put that in, and town allowed them to tie that into a catch basin or a manhole on Fulton Street somewhere.
So it sounds like there's an 8-inch pipe that's existing that carries water into the municipal stormwater system that's underground, under the road on Fulton Street. But there's no current proposed plan to modify the diameter or alter that pipe in any way. It's on private property. Is that
Private
right?
property.
Not our pipe.
Not your pipe. Understood. Yeah.
So that, under the current plan, the developers will not, take into account more water coming down towards Fulton Street. So that's not part of the plan. If I, clarification, please, so that I do understand. Sounds like they're not addressing what's coming down Fulton Street.
It's all elaborated in the drainage report.
And please, clarification, and for me, that means,
No increase in flow to Fulton Street.
thank you. Thank you, that's what I was looking for. So, under the current plan, there's not going to be any increase in flow of water down Fulton Street. Is that what I just heard?
That's the plan.
Sounds
Thank you.
correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And my second question, please, is about the ledge. Because we have lots of ledge, with a small amount of soil. So the houses that are being built, are they going to be level so they have base? And I know this might be more, this question may be planning board, I don't know, but it's going to get to what's happening. Will they have basements, please, the houses?
Yes, they will.
And will they be underground or will they be built on the ledge?
Depends on the lot in question. Some of the basements will be walkouts. If you're all familiar with the walkout, where basically, say the rear wall of the basement is kind of at grade. You can walk out of your basement to the ground. So where topography allows for that, that's what we would do. In other lots and other locations, it'd just be a normal basement in the ground.
So to get a normal basement means ledge has to be blasted out. And has there been, and I did hear some talk about, I think, hydrology. Has there been any looking at what effects the blasting is going to have on the neighbors? Please.
Mr. Chairman, everybody seems to be making an assumption that there's going to be blasting. And we addressed this at the planning board meeting, and we'll address it again here, second time tonight. There is no assumption that they will be blasting. There are different ways to remove rock that's in the ground. We built the St. Catharines, the same developer built the St. Catharines condos, the St. Catharines convent condos a couple of years ago without having to blast. Significant ledge on that site, maybe not as much as here, but they did it with jackhammers, and sometimes, depending upon the condition, the backhoe can take it under. They can get it out without blasting. So I think the suggestion that we keep hearing that they're going to blast the whole site is inaccurate and unfair. It is, it's a possibility. And if there is blasting, and we mentioned this at the planning board, but happy to mention it now, it's done by professionals who are very heavily regulated. We don't do it. We hire professionals that do it. There are insurance policies in place. A pre-blast survey is recommended within a certain area around the site. And it's up to the homeowners to take advantage of that, but it's recommended. And that is a protection so that if somebody comes back and says, I have a crack in my foundation, I didn't have, we've got the record, and it's an outside party that does the survey. We don't see it. But that is a way to measure whether there's been damage or not to somebody's home. It's very heavily regulated. But the reality is that on some of these sites, and you don't know till you start construction, some of these sites, you don't have to blast. You might say, well, oh my God, there's a ledge there. Why don't you have to blast? Not necessarily. To say the equipment can take it out, the hammer can take it out. We did that at the on Manhattan Street and had no problems either with the neighbors. Didn't have any claims. So, and you know, we do have responsibility if there is damage that comes to light. And we try to have a handle on that by encouraging everybody to do a pre-blast survey. It's easier for people to pursue the claim if there's a survey than to get in an argument about, well, you wouldn't let us in to do a survey, so how do we know whether this crack was here or not?
Right.
You know, so that's the way we're looking at it, and it's based on experience. My client has a great deal of experience in construction. But I just want to say it again, all these assumptions that there's going to be blasting all over the place with rocks flying everywhere. We've received communications on, you know, that pretty much say things like that. There's no basis, in fact, for those types of statements.
All right.
There may be blasting. We don't know yet. And, and if it is, an awful lot of neighborhoods have been constructed with blasting and doesn't lead to a lot of damage.
Yeah. The question was presented by our resident here, but some of the key points I feel like you made are that blasting could occur, but it's one tool of many that can be used to manage the site. And that at the moment, there's no definitive plan in place regarding what methods will be used to remove the material in question. And when that happens, you made a point to just be sure that it's not you going out to do the blasting. It's a licensed professional that has, you know, likely countless jobs under their belt and experience in doing this kind of work. And lastly, I think one of the big points you made is that there's an inspection opportunity for the residents and neighbors to have their property inspected prior to the activity and then following the activity. And in the case that something's identified as a problem, it would be addressed accordingly.
Right. That's what the pre-blast survey is for.
Okay.
May I ask as a follow-up, please? Will we be notified when and if the pre-blast surveys are available to us? And who would do that, and how would residents hear about these, please?
Sure. Yeah, I would just say that as a reminder, we do have to try to focus on the bylaws and regulations that fall under the purview of this commission. And some of these things that we're touching on are not necessarily directly under our control, quite frankly, with no authority really to affect them. However, if the applicant would be pleased to respond to your question, I think it's totally reasonable.
I'm about hitting the limit of my ability to talk about blasting.
Understood.
But I will say that we plan to have at the next meeting of the planning board, somebody who's in that business. My client said he'd have somebody at the meeting who could explain it based on that person's professional work and experience. So I think that some of those questions would be answered at the planning board when we next meet. I think we're scheduled 22nd of May. I think we're going back to 22nd of May.
I appreciate you taking the time to provide that insight, Mr. Hearn, despite the scope of tonight's meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. June 5th.
Please.
All right, I'm sorry, June 5th.
District 3. Has the town?
Could you just cite your address? Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Could you approach the podium and just cite your address for us? I appreciate you.
It'll help the owl see so that people who are joining us online will be able to hear you.
Just want to make sure the little
Speak.
camera can
Oh,
capture
sorry.
you. That's all. It's okay. Appreciate you
Thank
being
Mr.
here.
Chairman. As the town engineer.
If you would just repeat,
Oh, yes.
it's okay, your name and your specific address for
Judith
us.
Howard, 200 Nichols, town meeting member, District 3.
200 Nichols.
Yes,
Thank you.
please. Has the town engineer made any recommendations, made a list pertaining to conservation in this project? And has he delivered it to the commission? Do the neighbors know if he's made any recommendations?
I think it's a great question. Ms. Jones, what is the current status of Mr. Ryan's input related to stormwater or other conservation mechanisms?
Issues, yeah.
So Mr. Ryan, through the planning board, has provided review of the project and has fairly extensively related to stormwater, as well as a number of other issues on the site relating to things like road width, for instance. So he has not provided review related to conservation issues specifically under the purview of this board, but he has reviewed the stormwater. And my understanding is that he is satisfied with the stormwater plan. And his sort of last remaining comment to be addressed was related to the road width, which I believe has been addressed.
Is that letter or comment on the website?
Myself or another member of the planning staff can share Mr. Ryan's
Planning.
review memos with you.
Okay, no conservation.
No.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being here tonight. Other members of the community here to speak this evening? Just restate your name and address for the record.
Thank you, Kathy George, 11 Myrtle Street. I just wanted to bring attention to that blasting ledge can have an impact on wetland areas and the watershed within the wetland area. And there, for reference, in Pat Gardner's letter to the commission, he does touch upon that. So removing ledge can change the storage capacities and groundwater recharge and directional flows to the wetland within the entire watershed area. I will say that one of the reasons I mentioned we've been here for 40 years in this neighborhood is we know the ledge. And what we know about the ledge is a lot of us have basements that aren't full height because the ledge was not able to be excavated just by hydraulic hammer or backhoe. It's too hard to, we've had backhoes come and jackhammer down. Hydraulic hammers come and jackhammer down to as far as you can go, and then the ledge is too hard. And that's where you would need blasting. So we have that kind of ledge, on our properties, which abut this property. So I think it is a valid assumption that there's going to be ledge on that property that would need to be blasted, because we have it in our yards and we're abut. And I don't know if we took a survey, but I know growing up as a kid, I thought everybody's basement was supposed to be short and you all had to duck. So I have a ledge outcropping in my basement. So that part of my basement is only 3 feet high. And then the rest of the basement is still, I'm a 5'3" and I have to duck. So I do think that it's, given that information, it's highly likely blasting would be necessary to construct the basements that they want to do, which is full height. Newer construction in the neighborhood, people do slabs. So they're not doing basements. That's what's been done at the bottom of Myrtle Street where the new homes went in the 80s. So it's like I said, it's a unique site. And so I would hope you would consider that the likelihood blasting is highly done and that it can have an effect on the wetlands, and I hope you address that in your deliberation.
Thank you again. Mr. Hearn.
Mr. Chairman, a point of observation, I'm familiar with many of the houses on Myrtle Street, and they're older houses built at a time when the technology we have now was not available. So it doesn't necessarily translate into the idea that blasting is an absolute requirement to put a basement in. When you compare houses that are 100 years old, 80 years old, compared with today's technology that's available. So I just want to make that observation.
Understand the point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other members of the community here to speak this evening on this hearing? All right. With all that additional information, do we have further questions or comments from the commissioners?
I have one question.
Go ahead, Mr. Gill.
Okay, in regard to the overall site, as far as the ledge is concerned, I know you mentioned earlier that you had done some test pits for groundwater, but, has there been any site probing to determine like the profile of the ledge throughout the site?
Yes, we've done test pits all over the site. And that information is all included in the hydrogeological assessment that was done and provided to the planning board. And that was reviewed by Tetra Tech.
Okay.
Ms. Rockland.
I'm very interested in the stormwater aspect. It seems to be what everybody is very concerned about. I'm generalizing, including engineers who are concerned about it. So I would love to see, I suppose, another assessment of the stormwater study that was done, of water balance and so forth, and the effects of Jerry Hopcroft was mentioning, removal of trees, removal of rock and so forth. I guess peer review.
Yeah,
I think it sounds like that would be a important thing to have done.
Thank you, Ms. Rockland.
I had a question about the 8-inch pipe that was exiting out of the wetland onto Fulton Street. Is that truly a pipe for groundwater, or is it a culvert like exiting? I was just trying to get clarification of where that water's.
Well, I mean, obviously what has happened here historically on this property is that during certain times of year, water, whether it's groundwater or surface runoff, runs down through here and then ran through the neighbor's property. So the neighbor went to the town and said, can we put a pipe in here to take care of some of this water so it's not always in my yard?
So the entirety of the pipe is submerged underground?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the opening of the pipe is above ground.
Right.
So it takes surface water and transmits it
So
into
the grade, the yard grade next to us right here is probably 12 inches higher than where this inch of the stream ends. And then that pipe that 8-inch pipe just kind of sticks out and sits right at our surface grade.
Yep.
And then the lawn goes over it. So it was done there to pick up this water that has obviously been going here for a long time. Which may be the reason why, at some point in the distant past, a berm was built here, which basically created this BBW. And that may have been, that berm may have been an effort to kind of slow
Preliminary
down some
attempts
of
to
that
deflect the
you know what I
water,
mean?
sure. Yeah.
But, the water's gonna go where the water's gonna go.
Okay, Ms. Jones, that pipe, so privately owned,
Yeah,
interconnects with the municipal stormwater system.
yes.
So generally, we don't want to add more water flow to our piping system, right? We prefer infiltration. Yes.
Yes, certainly, right? Infiltrating in the groundwater is better than just shipping it to the receiving waters, right? In particular with MS4 or potential consent decree regulations about total daily load and other things like that. Yeah, I think you're making a very valid statement.
And so there is the concern that when you're blasting out the rock, and you're putting in more impervious surface in the form of buildings with their roofs and the driveways and the roads. So there's less infiltration. And there's a question of how much infiltration will actually happen with imported soils on bedrock. So this area, we've been pointing at on the right side of the map where there's the bordering vegetated wetland, the BBW and the intermittent stream. So that may drain more water than in the past. And that goes down slope, so towards the neighborhood on Fulton, right? Towards this 8-inch pipe that a neighbor owns, which may not be large enough to deal with that water. So that's a concern, right? So that's there again is the call for another review of the study that's been done on stormwater and infiltration. That just emphasizes to me the need for that. Sorry, I was talking out loud.
No, it's fine. I appreciate you, thinking aloud and sharing your position. I think that you and I think the rest of us are likely thinking the same thing, that it's going to keep resulting in that conclusion that this needs to be looked at more closely, in particular in areas where the planning board's peer review didn't maybe touch on some of the things that conservation is most interested in. How about remote communications with any content or substance that was not touched upon this evening by members of the community that are here in person that would be relevant to read for the matter of record?
I think that all of the subjects under the commission's review that we've received correspondence about have been spoken to.
Actually, can I ask one thing? So one of the letters, there was a concern about mosquitoes and the detention basin. Wondering if you can speak to that, just to allay this family's concerns, standing water, mosquitoes and so forth.
The wetland is a standing water. You know, I always get this question. I mean, that wetland has water in it probably for half the year. Stormwater basins are designed to drain within 3 days of a rainfall event. So that's kind of how the state and everybody addresses that question.
And Mr. Chairman, this is Scott Goddard. I'm in remote. I'm only here as a representative of the applicant, professional wetland scientist. So I'm available along with Dan Merrick and team for questions if any are pertinent to my area.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Nice to hear from you.
There's a lady back there that raised her hand.
Do we have a hand in the back? Would you like to step forward? Yeah. Just identify your name and your address for the matter of record before you.
Diane George, 11 Myrtle Street. My concern is about trees and removal of trees to build these 19 homes. Trees take up a lot of water, tree roots. And to build these homes, a fair number of trees will need to be cut down. I understand that there are guidelines as to how many need to be kept. But I would like you to consider the amount of water that will, I don't know, I don't understand hydrology, excuse me, that well, but the trees, the water that the trees take up and how that would be impacted if they were taken down. And does that fit in with the surveys we already have? And maybe it's already been done by the hydrologist.
Yep. So just making sure I understand the question. We're really just talking about considerations surrounding the removal of trees, the water they drink, and how that's being offset as part of the stormwater design. Is that right? Yeah.
We've had this question a number of times. The stormwater report and standard methodologies for stormwater design take into account changes in vegetative conditions.
Yeah. So the answer is yes. They do think about that in their stormwater analysis. Vegetation or the water that's being consumed by the trees. It's part of the balancing act. Any other members of the community with questions? I apologize if I missed that hand in the back. All right. Ms. Jones, we've had a lot of information presented. I would say some of like the loudest resonating thoughts in my mind are that we certainly need to proceed with consideration and intent. And I think that there's a strong legal component of what's been discussed tonight that I certainly welcome further input from town council about. I think that Ms. Rockland and some of the rest of the commission feel pretty strongly about proceeding with a peer review for conservation's interests, performed by the same consultant that serves the planning board. What other recommended next steps do you have for us?
I think that that should give us plenty to chew on, by the next time that this comes before us. Seems like good next steps. So, to clarify, the request for additional input from council is a written opinion what we're looking for, or do we want them to come to the next meeting?
Maybe both. I think that I often, just speaking as an individual, feel ill-equipped to react to some of the legal talk. And I think it could fast track some of the at least official conversation if town council were present for the next meeting. Not to say that it can serve in lieu of a more formal court hearing or something that could end up resulting in all of this, but I just think sometimes I don't feel like without town council here, there's much that can be said in response to some of the positions that are presented.
I feel very confident speaking with the Chinese, but that makes sense. All right.
Mr.
All right.
Chairman,
Sir,
can I just ask a question on the peer review?
Mm.
You had mentioned the state firm that did the work for the planning board, but they weren't looking at wetland science issues, and I thought that Ms. Rockwood had mentioned a wetland scientist to review the wetland impacts.
I heard that too.
Okay. So do you have another wetland scientist you could hire to?
I think if that firm doesn't have a wetland scientist, it could be.
Yeah, so we'll go through Tetra Tech, and if they don't have someone on staff, then I'll just ask them to subcontract it.
Who do you guys usually use for peer review?
We usually use OEC for wetland peer review, but I think that Tetra Tech will be well equipped to address the stormwater issues on site in particular.
But the wetland impact issues go beyond stormwater, of course. I mean,
Certainly, yep.
And we raised the issue with blasting and how that could change the hydrology and the groundwater flow, and stormwater only deals with surface water flow. So
Yeah, so I think looking at the water budget going into the wetland and then into that 8-inch pipe that's downstream of the wetland could be one of the issues that is under consideration for peer review. That's what the commissioner is interested in.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for Ms. Rockman, but I feel like that's in line with some of the interests that were presented. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Kathy George. I was wondering if, when you go about having a peer review, if you could ask that they respond in writing to Mr. Cheskie's letters and Mr. Pat Garner's letters, so that we know, make sure all that analysis is taken into account in writing, so that nothing gets missed. You know what I mean? So I would hope you could have the peer review, supply them with Mr. Cheskie's and Mr. Garner's letters, and ask them to provide comments on them.
I think it's fairly, I don't want to overspeak, but I think it's fairly typical for the peer reviewer to have access to the materials associated with the project, right? So
I think they could have access to the materials. I'm not sure that it's legal for us to have them provide review of the public comments. We might have to limit the scope of the review to the application materials and the site conditions itself.
reasonable. Mr. Hearn, you had your hand?
The point is to do a peer review of the applicant's
The application.
proposal, not a peer review of what everybody else might have to say.
Understood.
That's, they have the opportunity to comment. Peer review is sort of a neutral party looking at it for the board that is considering the matter. In this case, your board,
Yep,
exactly
certainly.
the planning board.
Certainly. Yep.
Just so you know, where things stand with the planning board is that we have agreed to provide some written response to the comments received from the public. It may not be a point by point. A lot of these comments are highly repetitive. And that Tetra Tech will review our response and then provide advice to the planning board on that. So that's forthcoming. It's not done yet, but that's something that will be coming down the road.
Okay. Sounds like that might alleviate some of the consideration that's being requested anyways. Sir?
Mr. Chairman, are not all of the documents that we submitted now public documents?
Yes.
And there should be no reason why the peer reviewer shouldn't be able to see them, at least to get an idea of the issues of concern. I don't mean that he needs to do a peer review of our comments, but rather to understand the issue.
Yes.
And for the record, we understand that. We don't have any objection.
Understood.
Our concern was being asked to review somebody else's view of the project. So of course, anything that's in the file is fair game for review by the peer reviewer, as well as any member of the public, I suppose.
Put more eloquently than I could have. Thank you, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you.
Other hands in the audience, forgive me, there's a large crowd tonight. Okay,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so, more comments that we received in writing. There was concern over, tree border, people wanting there to be a tree border between the development and their yards. And the concern over wildlife species being displaced. Is, I'm, as a newer Conservation Commission member, I just wonder about like, in past cases, like, has that been considered? Is that part of our purview?
I
Is
think
that
the
not?
wildlife study component of it could be.
Yes, I wouldn't recommend necessarily a wildlife study because there's two reasons. There's not, it seems unlikely that there's any rare or endangered species. And there's not a lot of habitat disturbance within the 100-foot buffer zone. And the areas that are being disturbed are largely lawn outside of that. So for the habitat study, when someone does a habitat study, they there's different triggers for it based on, we have the discretion within our bylaw to require it as needed. Within the Wetlands Protection Act, there's different triggers like certain amount of impacts to bank, certain amount of impacts to bordering land subject to flooding. And they're looking for certain things like, does the bank have overhangs, holes in it, snags that could be providing habitat to birds, etc. And often the goal is that if changes are being made to habitat within the commission's jurisdiction, that the habitat benefits that are being eliminated by the plan are then replicated in some way. For instance, if you're cutting down snags, then maybe you're putting poles up for roosting, right? And what we're seeing is not a lot of disturbance within our buffer zone areas. So the commission is within their ability to have a habitat study, but I don't think that we would see a lot of impacts like that where we would be sort of getting specific changes suggested as a result of it.
Okay, and in the realm of the other plantings that Ms. Rockland referenced, I know historically we've had exchanges where something was gently requested by a member in a butter or otherwise, and a member of the community or in a butter, and the applicant, not necessarily because they were required to, but of their own accord, has decided to acknowledge or satisfy that kind of request.
Yeah, so the request was, I believe, keeping trees around the perimeter as a privacy screen function.
Which we're doing.
What's that?
We're doing that.
Yeah, okay.
That's one of the reasons for the retaining walls, is so that we don't have to cut down all the trees around the property.
Can you describe what that will look like, that you're leaving trees, what
Well, it
what the
varies
width
all
will
over the
be?
site. It's on the subdivision plan, but, you know, there's a limit of work. And, you know, in some areas, there are more trees than other areas, but wherever we can, you know, we're preserving, you know, perimeter strips. Like, this is the area with the retaining wall, and that retaining wall is largely to preserve a strip of trees through here. That's why, you know, retaining walls are expensive, you know? So, we're not doing that just for the sake of doing it. We're doing it so that we don't have to cut the trees all the way.
So what's the width of that retaining wall?
The strip?
Sorry, yeah, the strip.
It's maybe 10 or 12, something like that.
And then the retaining wall, so the properties that are on the Fulton Street side will be lower in elevation than the properties that are on Fulton Street.
That strip is 50. Which properties?
The properties on along that strip that we're discussing.
Yeah, all the existing homes on Fulton Street are below until you get up into this territory where the house is.
Okay.
Come up a little bit higher, but they're still gonna be below it. Everything except for the homes on Myrtle Street are below our site, topographically speaking.
Does that cover your questions too, Ms. Jones? Nice.
Sorry, last time.
All right.
Just on the wildlife study,
Mm.
my read of the bylaw was that you had the discretion to acquire a wildlife study of the project area, not just a buffer. So I think the concern is not just whether the buffer provides habitat, but the entire project area, which is upland to the wetland, is not just a 100-foot buffer, it's the entire project area. So we would respectfully request that this is appropriate given the tremendous amount of wildlife that is existing on the site and near the wetland, which Mr. American just said is full half the year. So.
Chairman,
Mr. Hearn.
on that point, this is not virgin land.
Mhm.
There are two houses up there, three houses, swimming pool, a tennis court. Not as if we've got a piece of land covered in trees that has never been disturbed and is teeming with wildlife. There are people living there and they've been living there for decades. So I don't know that this is a case where anybody could reasonably expect that all of a sudden we're disturbing a large number of different types of wildlife, and that a wildlife study is warranted. Might think differently if we were talking about a site that, a large site that had never been touched. This is not that. This is our use as residential property. It has been developed. So I would think it's not really, I think it's discretionary. I don't think it's called for in this particular case.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn. Ms. Clement?
What percentage of the 10-acre lot would you describe as currently wooded?
It's hardly what
Wooded?
I would have to get that.
Okay.
Interesting. Any other new questions? All right, Ms. Jones, back to recommended next steps. We were talking about a peer review. We were talking about continued involvement from town council.
Yes. So my recommendation for now is to continue until the 31st of May. And I'll work on getting those set up.
And site visit as well. I'm sorry, yes, site visit as well. Yep. Okay, so forgive me, what was the date of the next?
May 31st.
So we'd be looking for a motion to continue this to May 31st at a time to be determined.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Bamber. Thank you, Ms. Rockland.
I think we need to set a time if we're going to continue it by public proclamation.
Hmm.
Otherwise, we'd have to start.
No,
doing-
that's not correct.
Well, you continue it, what time?
The meeting will start at 7:30.
That's what I was expecting to hear. that to continue this matter till 7:30 on May 31st.
Well, just to ensure that you understand, it may not be the first agenda item.
I appreciate that.
The meeting will
You can
occur at
start a meeting
7:30.
Later than the posted time. But you can't start it earlier and you've got to post the time. But for public notice, I have no problem showing up at 7:30 and you get to us at 8.
Right. When I say at a time to be determined, it's not the meeting time that's to be determined. It's the particular slot of the agenda that will be determined when it's posted.
But from a legal point of view, in terms of telling people that it may start as early as, just say it, we say a time, but the meeting is 7:30. And if the motion is to continue it to 7:30 on 31st of May, that covers it. But otherwise, it leaves open what time on the 31st.
All right, Mr. Hearn, this is how we've done it every
appreciate
meeting
that.
for the duration of my chairmanship. So thank you for your point.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the boards to be clear.
That's fine. Now then. The vote on the motion just moved by, I think it was Mr. Bamber and Ms. Rockland. As we've done in the remote and hybrid environment, I'll go down the list of Conservation Commission members and ask you to verbally state your position on this vote, starting with myself. Stephen Washburn is in favor. Aye. Catherine Washburn, boy. Catherine Walsh is absent. Carly Rockland, what do you say?
Aye.
Peter Bamber.
Yes.
John Gear.
Aye.
Kelsey Quinlan.
Aye.
That'll do it for tonight on that one. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up on the agenda, we have a certificate of compliance request for 59 Puritan Place. This is going to be DEP file number 251-0344, Norwood number N2004-08.
So we've continued this request multiple times in anticipation of the applicant finishing installation of plaques showing the no disturb zone. They still haven't managed to do that. So I would recommend to the commission at this time to deny the request for the COC and the applicant can reapply when they're ready.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Bamber. Thank you, Mr. Gears. We're done in the remote and hybrid environment. Go down the list of Conservation Commission members and ask you to verbally state your position on this vote, starting with myself. Stephen Washburn is in favor. Aye. Catherine Walsh is absent. Charlie Rockland.
Aye.
Peter Bamber.
Aye.
John Gear.
Aye.
Kelsey Quinlan.
Aye.
All right. Thank you for that. That looks like the end of the public hearings and moves us into Conservation Commission business, starting with Indian Orchard Subcommittee update. What do you say, Holly?
We have had installation installed, but it's not hooked up yet. And
The irrigation, right?
yes,
Yeah.
thank you. And I do want to give a big thank you to our volunteer students from Norfolk IE who were out last Thursday helping remove the watering bags that are around the trees and do other sort of spring cleanup at the orchard.
You think that's gonna open up more opportunities to use some of their resources?
Yeah.
Good.
I have their cell phone numbers.
All right.
Not
Oh,
the students. but
Whoa,
the teachers.
okay. We got your number. We know where to find you. Okay, very good. I'm very excited about the irrigation. I think I was talking to a member of the community over the weekend and they mentioned they saw the activity taking place. And it was someone that had helped us in the past doing some of the watering, and there was certainly a sentiment of relief expressed.
Yeah, and I would add too, the work at the community garden is all done and it looks beautiful.
Agree.
So I will thank the Conservation Commission for the purchase of that fence on behalf of the community garden and overall Norwood community, as well as the DPW for doing all of that work.
Yeah,
It
that
looks
last piece really
phenomenal.
matters a lot to me. I think that Mark Ryan and his team put forth an incredible effort to make that come
Yeah.
together, and it looks like the brand spanking new facility and install or whatever. I love it. There was also the work done in the parking lot that was really nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
They always do a good job.
Agree. Yep. Okay, that's wonderful stuff. How about a CPC report? We don't have Catherine Walsh, AKA Washburn, here with us this evening. Do you want to say anything about CPC stuff or just wait until we see Catherine next
Let's
time?
wait on that.
All right.
Peter Washburn.
Peter Washburn, do you have anything to say? There's the whole Washburn crew, I guess. All right, so we'll hold on the CPC report until we have Catherine back with us. How about an agent update, Holly?
Okay, so in addition to thanking the Norfolk IE students, who helped us not only at the orchard, but also at the Cooper Park, at Peswick Park, at Aloysius Park and at Ellis Pond Dam. So they really got the tour. I also wanted to thank NEPRA for organizing an Earth Day cleanup at the Cooper Park since the last time we met. I also wanted to thank Commissioner Rockland for providing the commission with native goldenrod plants, an entire kiddie pool.
Yeah,
of
hundreds,
native
right? Not
goldenrod-
a few plants,
No,
hundreds, right? Thank
hundreds.
you.
Which were planted at Keswick Park by our Norfolk Aggie students, which I was so grateful that they did it and it wasn't me there for hours.
Well, thank you to
They were
them,
very
but thank you to Carly for providing the plantings, though. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And then I also wanted to let the commission know about, oh, actually, the other thing is I recommend there's an upcoming event at the library called Kill Your Lawn that I recommend to all the commissioners and anyone listening. It will be very much in line with the one that
When is
Carly
that?
gave. It's on May 16th. And at a time to be determined.
Well said.
Yes. So I also wanted to let the commission know about a change in staffing that is taking place in the community development department. With Sarah taking the director role, I have been offered and accepted the assistant director of community development. So the position that Sarah previously had. So we will be looking for a new conservation planner. I will continue to be the acting agent and not drop any of the balls that the commission has in the air, knock on wood. But there will be some changes and hopefully they're exciting changes coming in the future. And I know that Sarah wants to rearrange some of those responsibilities so that you know, I'm still able to pinch hit for the commission if that's needed.
So you'll still be our ringer?
So yeah.
Okay.
So that's my
Happy for
update.
you. Congratulations. Sad for our
Very
loss.
literally an agent update.
Mm. All right, Holly. How about the last item here? We have meeting minutes from April 5th, 2023 to approve. Do I have a motion to approve this?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Bamber. Thank you, Mr. Gears. We're done on the remote and hybrid environment. I'll go down the list of Conservation Commission members and ask you to verbally state your position on this vote. Starting with myself, Stephen Washburn is in favor. Aye. Catherine Walsh, absent. Carly Rockland.
Aye.
Peter Bamber.
Aye.
John Gear.
Aye.
Kelsey Quinlan.
Aye.
All right, how about one more?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Bamber. Thank you, Ms. Quinlan. As we've done in the remote and hybrid environment, I'll go down the list of Conservation Commission members. Ask you to verbally state your position on this vote, starting with myself. Stephen Washburn is in favor. Aye. Catherine Walsh, absent. Carly Rockland.
Aye.
Peter Bamber.
Aye.
John Gear.
Aye.
Kelsey Quinlan.
Aye.
Thank you. That's all.